Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Jonathan Waldrop. Jonathan is a senior director of cybersecurity over at Insight Global. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, good morning, Pete. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Jonathan. Could you give our audience a little background on yourself and your career thus far?
Sure, of course. So again, my name is Jonathan Waldrop. I've been in IT and cybersecurity for a little over 17 years. I got my start in the Air Force active duty, working around radios and radio equipment, ground to air, some navigational equipment around the airfield. And then over the course of a few years in my career, I moved more toward the technical side on the cybersecurity side. I've had several jobs over the course of the years in building and developing teams. I have created and hired teams in the military, from civil service to military members, and then also in my corporate world, post active duty military service, have built up and hired and put together a few teams, some from scratch, some from teams that were partially existing, and so been around the space for a long time. And really excited to talk about this today. Hiring and managing people and leading people is a passion of mine, and I get a lot out of it, and hopefully others do too. So I'm glad to be here to talk with you today.
Awesome. Yeah, and some previous guests I've talked to, we like to sometimes make the distinction between leadership and management, and kind of what that looks like, what a good leader looks like. I'm sure we can hit on that here shortly, but we usually start off with a question about the talent gap is the title of the show. So would you say that the talent gap is a real thing in security? And if so, what would you say it looks like?
So it's a hard question to answer yes or no. I think there is a gap in how we perceive talent in cybersecurity. I think there is a mismatch between what corporations and companies think of when they think of cybersecurity, and then what the skills are required to do that. A lot of companies think, oh, it's cybersecurity, we can't take a risk there, so we need somebody who's been there and done that. And that may be okay, or maybe your perspective for that time, but it's not a sustainable approach. And as we're seeing today in the market across the industry, it is tough to find people. But there's two sides to that coin, right? Is it that the people aren't there, or they're not trained, or they're not experienced, or are we looking for the wrong skills and experience? And I think the answer, as it always is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the skills gap as well. Yeah. Like, are there certain skill sets you could think of that maybe we're lacking as an industry, or they're just tougher to recruit and hire for some reason?
Technologists like to think of soft skills, or not that we like to think of it, but oftentimes soft skills are harder to teach. It's harder to find a way to motivate somebody. I mean, there are certainly ways to do that. Being in the military, motivation is a key part of that. And even any leader in any team, military or not, motivation, how do we find how people get the drive to go do something? And so that certainly is a key part. But I think there are potentially gaps in where companies think they need technology and where you have to have experience. One of the things that the military does really, really well is promotes people and moves people around based on potential to do something. And we don't embrace that quite as much on the corporate side, in my opinion. Because there is this emphasis on the bottom line, and is that something we can afford to take a risk on or not? The military has been doing it that way for a very long time, and so identifying potential in people is difficult to do. I think there are some tricks and maybe not tricks, but some tips and ways we can help do that a little bit more. So there is some gap between what people are hiring for, and then what the candidate pool and the skills pool is available. But again, I'm not always sure that when you read a job description, is that really the skill that's required? And I think if you actually sat down and talked with the hiring manager, or maybe the person that wrote that job description, maybe they're not even sure. Maybe it's more vague than that. It's rarely as crisp and clear as is present on a job description.
Yeah, hiring for potential, I've long been an advocate for. I think a lot of what creates the talent gap as people see it is they think, okay, well, there's not enough people out there that have done this job in, at a direct competitor or in this exact type of environment before, and that's who we need to hire. So there's very little hiring for potential. It's always looking for somebody that's done it before. What I found as an external recruiter, I'm reaching out to people that have done the job before because that's what my clients want to hire. But those folks rarely want to make a lateral move. If they think, okay, well, if it's the exact same job at a similar company, similar pay, what incentive do I have to switch jobs and, potentially uproot my life and stress my family more and stuff like that. It's a big life change to switch jobs. And I think people need to have an incentive to do so. And when you talk about soft skills and motivation, the people that are highly motivated, that are always looking for growth and advancement and stuff like that, they don't want to make that lateral move. If they're going to make that huge life change, it needs to make sense from, a career advancement perspective, compensation perspective, challenge perspective. The really smart people need an intellectual, stimulus when they're considering something new. So, yeah, you're totally right on that. So, how do you identify the folks that have those motivational pieces, that you're looking for? Do you rely on your recruiters to screen for that, or do you do that yourself usually in the interview process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are some ways to suss that out in an interview, and even on a resume, right? So we talk a lot about people that don't have experience in a professional setting, but if you volunteer, Cyber Patriot is an organization that has really come up and grown over the years. And it's like there's a lot of robotics teams out there. Cyber Patriot's a similar team or similar extracurricular activity for high school students to get into cyber and get hands-on experience in IT, touching routers and switches and computers. And so being an adult to volunteer in those areas is a great place to give you a lot of the material to go do that. So that's a really cool thing. Any sort of volunteer work like that, but your home network is one of the key ways, or maybe one of the common ways that people assess that. And that can absolutely be very true, but also I wouldn't put too much focus on it, because there is a monetary aspect in a lot of ways to that. You've got to have the machines to do that, or certainly the power bill increases when you do that. There's some interesting ways to again develop that internal home network. But again, it's not the one answer to everything. But I would again look for volunteer opportunities. Where have they gone out of their comfort zone to learn a skill, to help others, maybe volunteering and helping teach other people about cyber awareness, right? It doesn't take a whole lot to put together something that, phishing tips and tricks for an organization might be a good way to do that, right? So how, outside of the normal professional environment, how are you building some of these skills? And I think that is really one of the ways to identify people that are really motivated when they're not getting paid to do something and then they go learn. There are a lot of certifications out there. There's a lot of training. Certifications absolutely cost money. And I don't want to get into the debate of should we require cert? Should we not? Are they evil? Are they amazing? Again, there's always the answer is always somewhere in the middle. But I think again, to your point, identifying some of those motivations, it's people that are going outside of their what they're being paid to do to learn and grow and develop. And I think that's something as a candidate, people can really highlight that to the recruiter. But also, I think the recruiter is going to look for the person that the hiring manager is trying to hire. And so if you say you must have these things, if your must have list on your job description is 10 things long, you're going to spend a lot of time looking for that person. Really focus on a few core, 3 or 4, no more than 5 must-have requirements to be able to do that job. And again, look for adjacent technologies or adjacent concepts and fundamentals of the role when you're building that, again, to widen and broaden the pool of candidates that you're looking through.
Yeah, and I think sometimes what happens is sometimes it's a pretty heavy lift, especially if you're in a larger organization, to get that job description put together. And then once you have it, the tendency is to kind of just hand it off to the recruiter and be like, all right, go find this person. But I can't stress enough how important it is to sit down with that recruiter, especially if they're not a security specialist, and help them understand what you're looking for, and more specifically, why too. So if they see SIM on the job description, they know that they're not just looking for that particular acronym, that here's some examples of some SIMs that we might consider. There are other SIMs out there that aren't on this list that we'd also consider, and keeping an open mind, but basically educating the recruiter as to how to go out and find these people, and pushing the recruiter to not just rely on inbound applications, but to actually go out to the market and find these folks that are the best fit. Because oftentimes, if you're relying on these inbound applications, you'll get hundreds or thousands of applicants, and the hit rate on that is so low. I mean, the chances of somebody being a good fit on inbound applications, I would say 1 to 5%, somewhere in there.
Wow.
So it's just not a very high hit rate. But if you're going out to the market and searching for the people that you know are more likely to be a fit for your jobs, it's way more efficient. People don't get ghosted as much, and you're able to really keep your employer brand intact. So that's a great point. So the way I see hiring in security, there's basically two different strands of hiring. There's experienced hiring, and then there's entry-level hiring, and they're completely different. There's tens of thousands, if not 100,000 people or more trying to break into the industry. There's a glut of inexperienced candidates.
Yeah.
But then on the experienced hire front, especially for niche roles like DevSecOps or cloud security, something like that, the number of candidates is super low, especially if you want to hire people from certain environments. And that's where it can get very, very difficult to find that person that checks all the must-have requirements. So can you think of, I guess, an example on either of those sides of experienced hires or more entry-level folks, somebody that you hired and kind of the process that you went through, or maybe some of the challenges that you uncovered and looking for those folks?
For sure. So in the past couple of years, we have started to build out the team and grow it in different areas that we didn't have expertise before. And so that was a time where we looked for an experienced candidate. There's always a balance when you're hiring. I've said that many times already. But when you're hiring for a position and you come into a new job, there's really two key things. There's technical knowledge about the role, and then there's the organizational knowledge, the people, the internal processes of that team, how the widget gets made going through the process, right? And so those are two different things to account for when you're hiring and when you're coming into a new job. And so I've had positions where we really had a deep skills need. And so we said, okay, we do need an experienced hire. These are the things we'd like to have, 1 to N list. But again, these are the 3 or 4 things that I really must have. I need somebody with, network architecture experience to be able to make sure our network is secure at that layer 2, layer 3. We need, basic security technologies around detection, those kind of examples. And so again, we're able to find the right person to come into that role who had experience in a few things, right? They weren't an expert necessarily in any one technology, maybe deeper experience here versus there. But that was a point where we really needed there was a clear capability gap on our team that we had to fill. On the flip side, there have been other cases where we're expanding the team, or in some cases, starting a brand new function from scratch. Nothing exists, and we're going to grow this element of our organization. And so that's where we leveraged internal talent. We promoted people from like a service desk, for example, other kind of early career paths, I should say. because the internal knowledge of the organization was so key to understanding how this is going to work. We knew enough from the technical side, and we have services. Maybe you can leverage professional services from an outside company to balance that skills need. But the real core thing and the harder thing to learn is, how does the organization work? What team do I need to talk to get X done? And so we've had success both ways of hiring, somebody who's not technically experienced in the area, but really knows how our company and organization works because they've worked inside of our company for a year or two or more. So again, it really comes down to what the core need of that is. We could have easily said, no, I definitely need somebody who's been doing, identity for 10 years. Like, that's an option, sure. Or does somebody who knows how the onboarding process works between HR, like our recruiting team, HR, our internal systems, how do we get provisioned? And so knowing that process and then being able to apply the technology, again, it just provides a different approach to hiring. Again, it's unsustainable to always hire somebody who's experienced, because back in the 60s, late 50s and early 60s with the race to the moon, there wasn't anybody that had experience going to the moon. Nope, nobody had done it before. So if you're looking for that experience, guess what? Yeah, sorry, you're out of luck. So if you want to be innovative, if you want to move forward and really find new ways of doing things, you've got to look outside of who has done this before.
So how do you, I guess, in that scenario, build a business case for training that person, knowing that it's going to take, X amount of time or Y dollars or man hours to train this person when, like you said, you could easily go out to the market and, well, not easily, but you could go out to the market and find somebody that's been doing it for the last 10 years. How did you justify doing that, especially when you're talking about approval for, headcount and budgeting and stuff like that?
For sure. And that is always going to be a challenge. It's always expensive to hire people. And oftentimes it's very much well worth it. So where the balance there is I personally believe that the compensation is not, the monetary compensation is not the only way people are compensated for jobs. Yes, absolutely. We need to pay people fair wages. We all have bills to pay. We all need a roof over our heads and food to eat to feed our families. But there are ways that people can grow and develop. And that skills development is a means of compensation, right? It's preparing that person for the next step in their career. Hopefully at your company, you can retain that talent. But so I think it also comes to some of the core values of that organization. At our company, Insight Global, we have a very real internal drive to promote people and to develop the skills among our team. And so that is one of the core competencies and one of the core values of our organization is that growth and development. And so for us, it really fits in with the culture of who we are. And so it's easy to make that argument of, hey, we're going to help this person. We're going to promote them into this role. We're going to pay them a fair wage. We're going to pay them, within that market range. But then also, here's the plan for that growth and development, because as people's skills increase, you also need to compensate for that, right? Again, part of that's retention. Part of that's just being a good business person and being a good employer, taking care of your people like that.
So what I'm hearing is the tone comes from the top to be able to train people into roles and develop professionals and stuff like that. I would imagine it's a lot more difficult to make that business case if the executives aren't bought into that vision of, hey, we need to develop employees and provide them a roadmap and compensate them appropriately and stuff like that.
Yep.
Have you ever managed to hire somebody not from elsewhere in the organization, but from the outside in an entry level or a junior type of role?
I have, yeah. So, and that is also tricky because it partly depends on your interview process, right? People on your team, if they're interviewing somebody they're going to work with, if they see somebody who has a skills gap that's too high to overcome, they're going to see it, oh, this is just more work for me. I'm going to have to train this person and I'm going to be responsible for doing my day job, right? So you really have to have a good, clear path on that growth and development for those individuals. And again, that's something that everybody has to be on board with. Some people are better and more natural at that training than others. But again, the culture starts at the top and the leader of that organization. And for me, anytime I write a job description, one of their responsibilities is train, mentor, and collaborate with your peers, with people on your team, with other parts of the organization, with technical and non-technical team members. You have to be able to coach and be coached. That again, for me, that's one of that's a deal breaker, frankly, for me on our teams.
Yeah, so I think there's essentially two types of folks in hiring for a lot of, say, senior individual contributor level people. You have the people that want to be management track and want to train and mentor and manage people, and then you'll have the folks that want to, put their head down, do their work, and then clock out. They care more about the tech than they do about managing people. They just want to get stuff done. Do you see there being a place for the folks that just want to put their head down and get stuff done? And how do you allocate that talent for those types of folks versus the people manager types within your team?
Yeah.
Like, do you have parallel tracks, or how does that work?
For sure. And you said it right there, parallel tracks, right? So we have to develop pipelines for people to be experts in a technical area. Imagine if nobody ever mastered routing and switching. Like if everybody was pretty good, and then but leading people was their passion, so they promoted and they moved into leadership role. Well, your leader, if you're the leader of your organization is the most technical person on your team, then you have a problem, right? My team will tell you I am definitely not the most technical, and that's fine. That's the way it should be. We also need paths for people to promote and to, from a monetary compensation path, have the same level of potential in that technical path versus people leaders. A lot of people think, the only way I can grow and develop in my career is then to start managing people. And to your point, some people love the technology and they want to be heads down. They work well with people. They collaborate and they train, they mentor, they're trained themselves, they learn, but they don't have a desire for that management and leadership aspect. And that's totally fine. We don't have to have both. And in fact, I would argue you have a really, really hard time doing both, being very technical and being an effective leader. And so that's where, again, it starts in that organization to have the path for that. And that's very tough. Again, a lot of organizations think, if you want to promote, you've got to promote to manager. And if you take your brightest, incident response analysts and then promote them into management is a different skill than pure incident response. And so there is give and take. There's only so much time we have in the day. And so pushing people to be very, very good at both is a quick way for burnout. And then we get back to the original question we started with, is how do we solve the skills gap? Because you got people that said, hey, I'm tired of this. I can't do it anymore. It's driving me crazy.
Yeah. And it's a great point about sometimes when you move into management, you almost necessarily have to lose some of those technical chops because you're focused on something else. You're more worried about performance reviews and how people are hitting their goals and, where they need to get next in their career and fostering them and developing them as employees. And I think if you end up forcing people into trying to be super technical and then trying to be really good people managers, you end up with somebody who's not really very great at both. And that's really not ideal. It's almost kind of the idea of specialization. So that's why I've always been a huge advocate for having those parallel paths, because, as we discussed, some people just don't want to do the performance reviews and stuff like that. They'd rather be responsible for their own personal output at work and nobody else's, which sometimes I totally get. But what I've seen, especially in like CPA firms, a lot of consulting firms, they don't necessarily have that structure. It's basically move up or move out, or some will be okay with somebody hanging out in a senior consultant role for the foreseeable future, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time, it's you go up this single track, and that's just how it is. But the companies that are really able to retain people have those parallel tracks where people still do feel like they're advancing, even if they're not managing people. And there's a salary scale associated with, senior level SME type of status. So yeah, that's a great point. What about process as far as interviews, recruiting, stuff like that? Have you kind of gotten that figured out over the years? Like, here's how we need to have the recruiters reach out to people, then they move into the interview stage, then they move into offer stage, then focus on kind of closing them down and getting them on board. I find a lot of companies, especially when they're smaller, they don't necessarily have those processes nailed down. It's kind of more fly by the seat of the pants, and we'll figure it out as we go along. But I'm a big believer in process. So have you gotten that figured out over the years, and did that come from the top, or was that something that you kind of implemented?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think how hiring happens is so different company to company. There's the extremes of many interviews over a long period of time, which has its pros and cons. There's definitely the shorter side. Hey, we're fast, go from resume review to offer letter within a week, right? There's lightning quick ways like that. Again, it's somewhere in the middle. For me, what I found works is, again, it starts with having a good job description, a clear, concise. The job description should probably fit on one page. And then you have that conversation like we were talking about with your recruiter. And you go through, hey, these are the key things. These are the deal breakers, must-haves, that kind of stuff. Again, keep that pretty minimal. But it's very important to have that minimum understanding with the recruiter. Job boards, like you mentioned, it's really hard when you post a job, you get thousands of applicants, maybe depending on the type of role or where it is, and that's certainly something to be considered. But I think there is an important part of that, right? There are lots of places to go these days, social media and other types of boards where we advertise jobs, and you can pass them around and you say, hey, I saw this job, but I know my friend's looking, so I'll pass it over to them, right? So there's really good ways to collaborate and learn from there. We put a lot of emphasis in the security world on networking, and hey, if you know somebody, then let's hire that person that you know. And there is goodness there, but also be wary of hiring a team that all looks alike and all thinks alike. So I find a lot of value in that balance of, hey, this is a person that nobody's ever worked with, and that's neither good nor bad, because they come with a different experience, they come with different ideas, they have a different employment history, they have a different personal history, and so they think about problems in a different way. The best way we're going to solve big problems is by having a lot of different inputs of how to do that. And so I think that is a really core, or a key element rather, of hiring, is to go search for candidates and have a diverse candidate pool demographically, from a professional experience angle as well. That sort of diversity is really, really important. So when you're searching out and going through, typically what I found works for me, getting back to the process, is you receive some resumes, you review through those. Maybe your recruiter can give you the quick, hey, here's the highlight of the conversation from this person. This is their focus area. This is their passion. You want to be sure those align. Typically skim that down to a handful of interviews, depending on how many you get. Some people want to get all the interviews all at once, all the resumes all at once and sort through those. Some people take them as they come in, and you have to figure out what works for you at the pace you want to work. Do a quick phone screen, right? Do they have some of the technical ability? Are they personable? Do they talk? Do they speak well and present well? Can they convey ideas? Because that communication, regardless of what they're communicating about, that layer of communication is important, especially when you're building a team. And then I prefer a panel style interview with people on that team that they're going to work with, but then also people from adjacent teams that don't report under the same organizational structure, but they'll work with on a daily basis. That's really important in management roles. It's still pretty important on technical roles if you have teams that collaborate together. And then typically as a final interview, the head of the department or the senior person that's going to have that final hiring decision, you want to have that limited to just one or two candidates so that you can have a pretty clear process and have a yes or no at the end of that. You don't want to you don't want to send 5 candidates to your CISO for a SOC analyst, right? Because that's just not sustainable. Again, not that it's not an important position, it absolutely is. But once it gets to that point, that VP executive level, even director in some cases, you should have a pretty good idea that that's the person you want in that role.
Yeah, I think ideally you'd be whittling down the number of candidates as you go through the various stages. One best practice I've found, granted I'm an external recruiter, but I think this could be done with internal recruiters as well, is just have a weekly call, maybe on a Friday, to just talk to the recruiter and talk to them, especially if it's an important role for you. Talk about how the search went that week, what they're seeing. If they're seeing every candidate they talk to is $50K over the salary that you had budgeted, it's probably time to readjust. And the sooner you can get that realization and get things moving, especially if you're in a larger organization and it's not going to be quick to get something like that approved, the sooner you can do that, the better. Because this is how hiring processes get extended out way, way too long, is not being able to turn on a dime and being agile. So yeah, just a quick little input there.
Yeah, and I loved what you said about having regular conversations with your recruiter. In my experience, I've had a couple of searches that went on for a long time, weeks and weeks without, in between having a phone screen and nobody that passed the phone screen, if you will, to make it to a face-to-face or panel interview. And the thing that we started doing was, I talked to the recruiter and they said, well, nobody meets all these things. And okay, let's look at the resumes that you've put in the no thanks pile and let's revisit those. Because sometimes, again, if you, in your writing the requirements for this position, again, maybe you're not seeing that availability in the talent pool that's looking for a new position, or your pay, to our conversation earlier, your pay is not to the point where somebody's willing to make a move for a lateral, I've been there, done that type of a position. So go back through, if you've gone through, a week or more of recruiters recruiting and not having viable candidates, then go look at the pile that got discarded and sort through that again. Take a second look there. And in fact, I found success in doing just that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, really getting involved with the recruiters and understanding why they're rejecting people, why they're approving people, what they may be missing, what they're not missing. All of that is very important. You'd mentioned panel interviews. So I'm kind of of two minds on panel interviews. I think sometimes they can kind of feel like an interrogation, which would be the downside of the panel interview. Positive side being it is a higher pressure type of interview, and you get a sense for how that candidate handles pressure and is able to carry on a conversation basically with a bunch of different people at once. That's not an easy skill to have. So how do you make sure in those panel interviews that you're not burning out the candidate as they're going through your process and help them feel comfortable and not feel like they're being interrogated? That's
a great point. In my extensive kind of long history of working and interviewing for jobs, I have sat on literally the other side of the table where there's 3 people lined up in their suits and I've got my suit on and we're staring at each other. And it's almost like we're playing a game of chicken, right? Who's going to blink first? And then they had a very structured interview process. So they looked down, they read the question verbatim from their notebook. I responded, they write down it was not a good interview experience. On the flip side, I have had a panel interview, and I use air quotes on panel interview, where I had a 30-minute call with this person. We hung up. I had a 30-minute call with the next person. We hung up. I had a 30-minute call with the next person. And so guess what? I spent the first 5 or 7 minutes talking through my background 3 times over the course of this hour and a half. When you put everybody in that room and they all get the same thing all at the same time. And so they're going to ask, you're going to hear the questions that your other panelists ask. And so you're not going to repeat things and you're going to learn more about this candidate. Now, I will say there's 2 ends of the spectrum here. There's one that's the very structured, rigorous, here's the question that I must ask you that our HR department or legal requires. And sure, there's certainly a place for those. And then the other side is going into a panel interview and not having a plan. It is so important for the hiring manager, the person with that decision authority, to gather that panel before the interview to say, okay, here's what the job description is, here's what we're looking for, here's the type of candidate that is going to fit this bill, and then here's the resume of the individual that we're going to be speaking with. So take several minutes and review the resume. Don't give it the quick glance that, the average person looks at the resume for 3.7 seconds or whatever, tiny time frame it is, right? You want to have that good understanding of what you're looking for. And you want everybody in that panel to agree what you're looking for, because if you have somebody from the software engineering team that's really looking for somebody who's got software skills versus somebody from the network team that's looking for who's got, firewall IPS skills, like, you're going to have a hard time finding one candidate that fits both of those profiles. So you have to have a common understanding across that panel. And again, it's part of, I've put together panels that are people that are internal to our team, that people work with on a daily basis, and then others that you might work on a project once a week or once a couple times a month type thing. Again, so it really depends on the preparation of that interview process. I've been through it several times where I felt like, as the candidate, I was way more prepared for that interview than the people walking in to interview me were, and that's a bad position to be in. Everybody should be prepared when it comes to an interview like that.
Yeah, totally agree. And you hit on a few things here. To kind of summarize, communication, I think, is kind of the theme of this episode. It's so important to communicate with your recruiters constantly, with your interviewing panel constantly. Everybody needs to be on the same page, and a little preparation goes a long way. Like you said, it doesn't have to be an hour where you sit down and think about all the exact questions you're going to ask, but at least get on the same page of who this person is and what they're likely to be experienced in, what they're not likely to be experienced in. So you're not asking questions about things that obviously they don't have experience in, and actually caring about the interview. Some feedback when we do debriefs with candidates with some of our clients, sometimes they'll say, yeah, they hadn't even viewed my resume, or they didn't seem prepared. They didn't seem interested. They were looking down at their phone. You'd be surprised how often this stuff happens. And it's such an easy thing to get right. And if you get it right, that person, even if they're not a fit for that role, they're going to be impressed with the process. They're going to tell their friends about you. Word of mouth is super important, especially in security. It's a very, very small community at the end of the day, relative to the actual size of the marketplace of security pros. Everybody talks, and it's a very close-knit community. So making that a good experience for people on, the hiring side as well as the candidate side. If everybody had a good experience, you're more likely to get more good people in the door later down the road. So I think a lot of companies and teams don't think about the impact of that interview, what impact it's going to have on that candidate, and why that actually matters. There's a sense sometimes where hiring teams will kind of feel like, oh, they should want to work here. We're awesome. They should know that. Why can't they see that? There's almost a sense of entitlement. And we see that sometimes from the candidate side as well, where, they feel entitled to certain benefits or pay or whatever it may be. So I think ideally the interview process should be kind of a two-way street. It should be transparent. It should be full of expectation setting, which is, I think, something else we could kind of touch on. Could you think of some examples where early or late in the interview process or during onboarding or something like that, you made it a point to set expectations with that candidate and what they had kind of in store in the future?
Absolutely. One of the questions are so I've got a script, if you will, that I walk through in the initial phone screen. And the first 15 minutes is not me asking the candidate about their background. It's me explaining, here's who I am, here's what our company's about, and here's what this role is. And these are the things that this person is going to come in and be expected to tackle in the first, let's say, 6 months even. And it, spend a few minutes on the front end of that phone call to talk about that. It sets the candidate at ease, right? They're not immediately on the spot with a flashlight in their face saying, hey, tell me about what this bullet is on your resume from 5 years ago. Or even like just regurgitating their 30-second, this is about me speech, which we all need to have that. We need to hear that. There's certainly a place for that. But it is so important to set the tone of that interview, especially as an interviewer. You want that person to feel at ease. You don't want them to be nervous because you're not going to get a good, clear answer. You might not get the whole answer because they're nervous about what they're going to say, or did they misspeak about a word or a term or something, right? And so setting that that expectation from the beginning, because as you talked about, interviews are 1,000% bi-directional. It is just as important that the candidate feels like it's a good process as the interviewer does, and that is so very, very key. It's hard if you're a candidate and maybe you've been caught up in some of the layoffs recently, or you're out looking for your first job. Like there's a moment that comes that says, I need a job and I need a job now. I'll take whatever. But a lot of times if you're interviewing while you're currently working rather, again, it is absolutely something, and it is important for the candidate to have the opportunity to ask those questions. So candidates should definitely ask questions. Interviewers should account for enough time for those candidates to ask those questions and to provide full answers. Again, I've experienced it. I've heard of it happening where somebody says, "Oh, we got 3 minutes left. What questions do you have?" Well, I've got a page of 4 questions that you didn't talk about through this process. So let's go through them. And in a lot of cases, you learn about that organization by their interview process. What do they value? What do they look for, and how are they looking for it? And how do they treat prospective employees? As you mentioned, your company's your reputation is absolutely on the line. Certainly when companies are trying to come back in the office, a lot of them are. Some of them are certainly remote, and there's definitely a place for each, in my opinion. But your reputation is absolutely on the line, because we've all heard of, oh my gosh, that they'll go over there to work because it's awful. They have to work 80 hours a week or whatever. There's always horror stories. So again, people talk. People have neighbors and friends and go to kids' soccer games together and talk when those things are going on. So if you don't think, rather, let me say this, your reputation is at stake as an organization and even as an interviewer, right? If you're mean and rude and disruptive and interrupt the candidate, I don't want to work for that person, and chances are somebody else is not going to want to either.
Yeah, I love that best practice that you mentioned of just taking a little bit of time on the front end to set expectations and giving that candidate some time to relax before you start, quote unquote, grilling them. That is important. I've had so many candidates that I talked to them and I was extremely impressed when I talked to them, because I think I have sort of a conversational interview recruiter screen style, and that tends to get the best out of people in general. But then they'll interview with the company, and I'll do my debrief with them, and they'll just say, "Oh man, I bombed. I don't know what it was. I was just super nervous and I bombed. I knew the answer to the question, but I floundered and I got it wrong." And I think it's, in a lot of cases, it's because they were put on the spot right away and didn't have any time to collect their thoughts. Even if they were extremely prepared for the interview, when you're put on the spot, sometimes you just don't get the best out of people. So that's an excellent best practice. So it's great to hear that you guys are doing that and really paying attention to how people are reacting and stuff like that. It's, as you said, the interview process is definitely a two-way street. There's some selling kind of that needs to go in both directions, especially for people that have been in the industry a long time. They have many options. Even in this down market, there are certain skill sets that people have a ton of options, which leads me, I guess, to another point. When you get to the offer stage with a candidate, and say somebody has 4 different offers on the table or something like that, I've had as many candidate having as many as like 6 offers on the table at any given time. What do you do to lock down that person? And do you start earlier in the process, or do you kind of wait until you have interest from that candidate, they have an offer in hand, and then at that point make sure that the recruiters or what is your process? Would you reach out to the candidate yourself for that offer discussion, or would you have a recruiter do it? I know that's a lot of questions, but take it where you will.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a good question, and really good to think about. That is something that a great recruiter will ask that candidate when they're in that first phone screen. if they're taking a call about a new job, chances are they're taking other phone calls about jobs, and they may be they're expecting an offer because they just had a final interview, right? Sometimes the timing just doesn't work out, and that's fine. And congratulations to that candidate, right? Absolutely, don't want to downplay that. The worst thing that you could do is string it along. Oh yeah, we're getting ready to, we're probably going to I have to get approval for like all these types of things that are going to delay that. You want to be sure that you've got this, what approvals you need when, right? So before you even post that job description, like we talked about earlier, you need to know what the compensation model looks like. Is there salary? Is there stock incentives? Is there stock grants? Are there bonuses? All these types of things. And then as your recruiter's going through looking at these candidates, they should be asking those questions, because the last thing you want to know is that, oh, this person also expects a 30% bonus, right? Okay, that's not in the budget. 30% is a pretty good chunk and difficult to get approval to overcome that. And so again, you don't want to have that bad taste in the mouth from the candidate standpoint because we didn't iron out those things from the beginning. But an excellent recruiter is also going to talk to that person. Do you have other offers? Do you have other interviews? And sometimes candidates are reluctant to say that because you don't want it to turn into a competition. But hiring, frankly, is a competition. I have found the best experiences are when everybody is as candid as can be in this process. There are times where you've had candidates back out at the last minute because they accepted another offer. And the other item that often comes up or sometimes comes up is, well, I got X amount, $5,000 more offer from this other company rather than your company, and so it's tough there. You need to know what the target of that the compensation is, but you also need to know what the ceiling is, because those sometimes are different things. There should be a line that you have from your finance rep or your HR or whoever's dictating the top line of that salary range or comp range. You should know that approval not to exceed before you even start to offer the position. In my opinion, generally speaking, it's not worth $5,000 to lose a candidate, especially if you really believe in them and they hit all the marks and they're a great communicator. They've got great potential. You don't want to lose them for a couple $1,000. At the same time, you don't want to get in a bidding war because that's not sustainable either.
Yeah, and it brings up a good point. I think that somebody's salary ask in the beginning of a process may not be what they end up looking for in the end, because they are interviewing with other companies. If they get a couple other offers that are $20K more than your offer, I mean, at some point you just have to walk away and say, we can't hit that number. But having, I think, a salary range in mind in the beginning, but then also understanding if you needed to, could you flex up another 5 or 10K to get the deal done? I don't think a lot of companies or hiring managers think about that in the beginning. They just think, okay, here's my salary range. We'll find somebody in this range. Well, what happens when you get somebody to the end of the process? You fall in love with them as a candidate. You're like, this guy's perfect. I need him or her on my team. And you're 5,000 off, but you don't have approval for 5,000 off. Are you going to walk away? That's a tough scenario, but one that we see often. And I think it highlights the importance of the length of the interview process, how long it actually takes to get that whole thing done. There's an old saying in sales and I think recruiting, I say all the time kills deals. So the longer your interview process goes on, the more time that candidate has to get other offers or I've had this happen before where the interview process dragged out a long time. They didn't have an offer. They accepted an offer with a client. They started and then they left after like 5-10 days to take an offer with another company that took longer. So, but if that company had moved a little faster and got that person on board, they may not have had that interview that they ended up taking the job after they already started in another company. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to blame recruiters for some of this when it happens. We're kind of the middleman between the candidate and the hiring team. But, I would say to any hiring managers out there, we could be very, very good recruiters, ask all the right questions. But at the end of the day, people are people, and some people lie, people are fickle. There's only so much that you can plan for. At the end of the day, it's half art, it's half science, I would say.
Yeah.
Recruiting and hiring, and you can do your best to plan for the worst, I guess, but sometimes things just happen outside of your control. So that's why I believe in proactive versus reactive hiring. If you get in that situation where you're far down the road with a candidate and you really need that person to start yesterday, and they end up accepting another offer, well then, you're up a creek.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on time, but any thoughts on proactive versus reactive hiring and how you would manage that?
Absolutely. So going back to our discussion about the process of hiring and interviewing and getting your panel together, you absolutely must prioritize those times. The worst thing that could happen is, or maybe not one of the worst things that could happen, is saying, hey, we've got an interview slot for tomorrow at 2:30. Oh, sorry, I can't do that. And if today's Tuesday, the interview is going to be Monday or on Wednesday, you don't want to say, oh, well, I can interview them next Monday. Like that's too long, right? The prioritization that happens on that panel and getting that interview scheduled should be the top priority if it's really that high priority of a role. Nothing is more frustrating than the candidate to hear, oh, this is a really high priority, we're going to move fast, and then you move as fast as that hiring manager's calendar allows, without rescheduling other things. So prioritize, right? Put it on the calendar. These are the expectations to that panel of being here. Here's the plan. Here's how we're going to do this, right? Because again, it is really discouraging to that candidate to get through this process and think, okay, well, I need to, because that candidate's potentially taking time off of their current role to interview with you. And if you reschedule 15 minutes beforehand, that is really, really frustrating. So that must be prioritized. Obviously, in the security world, things happen. I've had, I was doing a phone screen for somebody, and they had an incident that kicked off, and I forget what the role was that we were hiring for or whenever it was. But I remember thinking, hey, you know what? I get it. You called me 30 minutes beforehand, said, hey, I can't make this time because of this thing that just kicked off, and I can't tell you the details because it's sensitive. Like, okay, we work in this world. I understand. A little bit of grace and humility goes a long way in the interview process.
Yeah, and transparency, like you said before, just giving people the heads up, letting them know, that goes a long way versus just taking an extra week without any explanation. It's really the silence that's deafening, I think, for people in the interview process. That's why people complain so much about ghosting on LinkedIn, even if it's just the company hasn't gotten back to them yet because they're waiting on some approval or the hiring manager's schedule or whatever it may be. But that silence is deafening. So, making it a priority, like you said, extremely important. So, yeah, we're coming up on time here, Jonathan. So just one last question for you. Is there anything that we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
I think we really need to take a deeper look at ourselves and ask, if you're a hiring manager, if you're a security leader or an IT leader, are you the problem when it comes to a skills gap or a talent gap or an employee shortage? Because having clear expectations up front is not an unreasonable request from a candidate perspective. You need to know, is the role hybrid? You need to know if there are specific hours that you're supposed to work. Those are things that should be talked about up front. You should know that compensation model up front. Hiring managers that in my opinion, pretend that anybody should be honored to come work for our company is not somebody I want to work with, because the interview process should be about the candidate and identifying the right candidate, and because that candidate is putting their livelihood at stake. And so we really need to do, as security leaders, as hiring managers, need to do a better job interviewing and looking for the right candidate. We talked about potential, we talked about motivation, we talked about upskilling and growth and development. So have a plan for that in your organization. As a leader, that should absolutely be part of how you manage and lead your team, is the strategic growth and development of your organization and how people are going to be equipped to do the job.
Yeah, and then in the interview process, recruiting process, communicate those things about that development plan to the candidate up front, which goes back to, more expectation setting and giving them a roadmap from the very beginning. Well, that's a great place to end. Appreciate your time, Jonathan. If people want to reach out to you, find you online, what's the best way to do so?
Find me on LinkedIn. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on, Jonathan. Thanks, everybody.